At my dad's 70th birthday, Mom stood up, raised her glass, and announced, "We're giving the lake house to Wyatt. He has a family." Everyone applauded. I didn't, because 3 years earlier, my parents had sold every share they owned in that house to me before I could say a word. Bethany, the realtor who handled the transfer, stared at Mom and asked, "Do they know you bought out their shares?" Mom's face went white. Wyatt looked between us. "Wait. What shares?" The room went silent. I thought the worst part was realizing my brother had been promised property that was mine. I was wrong, because when I looked at my parents, neither of them looked confused. They looked caught. The lake house had been part of our family for 14 years, but family property had never meant everyone owned it equally. When my parents bought the place near Brainerd, Minnesota, I was 26 and already working as a mechanical engineer. Dad and Mom wanted the house badly, but carrying the entire down payment on a second property would have stretched them too far. So I invested with them, not informally, not as some daughter helping her parents and hoping they remembered later. My name went on the ownership documents for the percentage I paid for. Dad owned 37.5%. Mom owned 37.5%. I owned 25%. My younger brother, Wyatt, was 22 then and just starting his career. He didn't have money to put into a vacation property, and nobody expected him to. Years passed. Wyatt married Serena. They had 2 kids, Lena and Bennett. I stayed single, and slowly, almost imperceptibly. The definition of family began changing around me. When Wyatt needed a bigger vehicle, Mom would say, "Well, he has a family." When holidays were scheduled around his kids, it was, "Children come first." And whenever the lake house came up, I started hearing things like, "Someday the kids will make memories there with their own children." I loved my niece and nephew. None of that bothered me by itself. What bothered me were the smaller comments directed at me. "You don't really need that much space. You can travel whenever you want. One day, if you have a family of your own, you'll understand." Never cruel enough to start a fight, just consistent enough to notice. Still, at the lake, none of it seemed important. We fished off the dock, grilled on the deck, argued over board games, and called the place what we had always called it, the family lake house. Back then, I thought that phrase described how we used it. I didn't realize my parents had begun using it to decide who they believed it should ultimately belong to. 3 years ago, my parents decided they wanted out of the financial side of the lake house. Dad was getting close to retirement. Mom was already talking about simplifying everything they owned. The property had appreciated. But so had the taxes, insurance, dock maintenance, repairs, and all the little expenses that come with a second home. They wanted the equity more than they wanted the responsibility. So we had the house independently appraised. It came back at roughly $600,000, since my parents jointly owned 75%. Their share was worth about $450,000 before the remaining mortgage and closing adjustments. I wanted to keep the house. They wanted cash. So I bought them out. And I mean actually bought them out. The old mortgage was paid off through the closing. I used my existing equity in the property. About $100,000 of my own savings, and new financing in my name. My parents walked away with a substantial 6-figure amount. Bethany Sloan, a longtime family friend and local realtor, helped coordinate the transaction. A title company handled the deed and closing paperwork. Dad signed. Mom signed. I signed. There was nothing secret about it. My parents used part of the proceeds to pay down their primary home and moved the rest into retirement and emergency savings. The only unusual part was that I wanted them to keep enjoying the place, so we put a 5-year family use arrangement in writing. They kept specific summer weeks and certain weekends each year. They could still bring the grandkids. They could still fish with Dad, grill on the deck, and sleep in the same bedrooms they always had. What they did not keep was ownership. No equity. No life estate, no right to transfer the property. For the first few months after closing, Mom called it Mallory's place. Then it became the lake house. Eventually, it quietly turned back into our lake house. I never corrected her. I thought everyone understood the difference between being welcome somewhere and owning it, apparently. I was the only one who did. Dad's 70th birthday was held at my parents' house. with about 18 relatives and close friends squeezed around two long tables. Bethany was there with her husband. She had known my parents for years, long before she ever helped with the lake house transaction. Everything was normal until Wyatt handed Dad a framed photo. It showed Dad sitting at the end of the dock with Lena and Bennett, all three holding fishing poles and grinning at the camera. Mom stared at it for a long moment. Then she stood and raised her glass. "I think this is the perfect time to tell everyone something." People quieted down. She smiled at Wyatt. "We've decided we're giving the lake house to Wyatt. He has a family." For half a second, nobody reacted. Then the table erupted in applause. Aunt Carol clapped. Someone said, "That's wonderful." Serena looked surprised. Wyatt looked even more surprised. I just sat there. Wyatt laughed awkwardly. "Seriously?" That was the moment I knew he hadn't planned this with them. Before I could decide what to say, I saw Bethany staring at Mom. Her expression wasn't shocked, it was confused. She looked at me, then back at my parents. "Lucille," she said carefully, "do they know Mallory bought out your shares?" The applause died instantly. Mom's face went white. Wyatt turned toward Bethany. "Wait! What shares nobody moved?" I looked at him. "Mom and Dad sold their ownership in the lake house 3 years ago." Wyatt frowned. "Sold it to who, me?" His eyes widened. What Mom jumped in immediately. That was just the financial arrangement. I stared at her. "No, Mom. It was a sale." Dad's jaw tightened. "You know what your mother means." "I really don't." Wyatt looked from me to them. "You told me Mallory took over the mortgage and expenses." "She did," Mom said. "That's not the same as saying you sold her the house." Mom lowered her voice. "The lake house still belongs in the family." I felt something in me go cold. "I'm family." Silence. Dad looked down at his plate. Mom looked irritated now, as if I were deliberately misunderstanding something obvious. "We're talking about the future. Mallory. The future of property I own. You know Wyatt has Serena. He has Lena and Bennett. That place should stay with the next generation." And there it was, not confusion, not forgotten paperwork, not a misunderstanding about who held title. My parents knew exactly what they had sold me. They simply believed that because my brother had children and I didn't, my ownership came with an expiration date they had chosen for me. Wyatt was the first person to break the silence. "I'm not taking Mallory's house." Mom looked at him like he had missed the point. "Nobody is taking anything. You just announced you were giving it to me." "That's not what I meant." Wyatt stared at her. "Then what exactly did you mean?" Dad finally spoke. "Mallory always said she wanted to keep the place in the family." I turned toward him. "I did. You changed 'keep it' into 'give it away.'" Mom exhaled sharply. "We assumed eventually you'd put Wyatt on the title, or leave it to him." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because they were discussing my estate plan at Dad's birthday table like I wasn't sitting 6 feet away. I'm 40 years old. "We're thinking ahead," Mom said. "About what happens to my property after I die." She hesitated. Then she said it. "You don't have children. Mallory." The room became unbearably quiet. "Wyatt has Lena and Bennett. They're the next generation. Who else would the house go to?" I stared at her. "My future, apparently, is something everyone gets to plan except me." Wyatt looked sick. Then he turned to Dad. "You let me thank you for a house you didn't own." Dad rubbed his forehead. We thought eventually Mallory would understand. Understand what Wyatt asked. "That having kids means I'm entitled to her property." Mom's eyes flashed. "Don't twist this." But there was more. Serena quietly asked, "Have you told the kids about this?" Mom didn't answer immediately. That was enough. Wyatt's face changed. "What did you tell them? Only that someday the lake house might be yours?" "Mom, they love that place. They're 9 and 6. Then Wyatt mentioned something I didn't know. Dad had given him a spare lake house key the previous summer. Wyatt had assumed my parents were allowed to. They weren't. Their agreement gave them access during specific periods. It didn't give them the authority to distribute permanent access to anyone else. Mom tried one last compromise. Fine, don't transfer anything now. Just make sure Wyatt gets it eventually. No. One word, no yelling, no debate. Mom stared at me. You'd rather let it go to a stranger someday? What happens to my property after my death is part of my estate plan. Not yours. Dad leaned back, disappointed. You're making this sound very cold. No, I'm making it sound like what we signed. Then I said the sentence that finally ended the argument. You kept family access. You did not keep the right to give my property away. I didn't cancel their summer weeks. I didn't ban anyone. But that night, I decided something else. From then on, the agreement everyone had signed was going to mean exactly what it said. 2 days after Dad's birthday, I changed the lake house access codes, not because I wanted to lock my parents out, because Dad had handed Wyatt a key to property he no longer owned, and nobody had thought to ask me. I replaced the old exterior lock with a smart lock, updated the garage code, and created temporary access codes for the exact weeks my parents were guaranteed under our agreement. Their July week stayed. Their fall weekend stayed. Every day I had promised them stayed. Mom called as soon as she realized the old code no longer worked. We've always had keys. And you still have every week I agreed to give you. That's not the point. It is exactly the point. You had access. Dad treated that access like something he could hand out. You make us sound like strangers. No, I'm treating you like people who sold a house and kept specific usage rights. She hated that sentence, but she couldn't argue with it. I didn't sell the lake house. I didn't cancel their reservations. I didn't ban Wyatt, Serena, or the kids. I didn't threaten anyone with lawyers. I simply stopped allowing assumptions to function like permissions. A few weeks later, Wyatt called me. Not Mom, not Dad, me. Would it be okay if Serena and I brought the kids up the second weekend in August? I checked the calendar. Nothing was scheduled. Sure. There was a pause. That easy, that easy. Apparently, Mom found out. That evening she called again. Wyatt shouldn't have to ask his sister for permission to use the family lake house. I closed my laptop. Then you shouldn't have sold me the family lake house. Silence. Dad tried a different argument. They had supposedly given me a good deal, so I pulled out the appraisal. $600,000, the same independent valuation all three of us had accepted. Then Dad pulled out his own closing folder. The deed. Settlement statement. Mortgage payoff. The amount transferred to them. His signature. Mom's signature. Nothing in that folder said temporary. Nothing said caretaker. Nothing said Mallory owns it until Wyatt needs it. They even asked Bethany whether there was some way to undo the sale. Her answer was simple. They had been represented properly. They had received fair value. They had signed knowingly. 3 years later, regretting what ownership meant was not grounds to reverse it. Some relatives still told me, but someday the grandkids should have it. I stopped debating. Someday is part of my estate plan. Today, I own it. Then Wyatt called again. This time, he asked one question. Do you actually want to keep the place? Yes. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, then that should have been the end of it. For the first time since Dad's birthday. I felt like someone in my family understood the problem, but my parents still hadn't admitted why they had announced it publicly in the first place. Dad came to see me alone about a week later. He didn't bring the closing folder this time. He didn't need to. I knew you owned it, he said. I waited. All of it. He nodded. So Mom didn't misunderstand the paperwork. No. And you didn't forget the sale. No. That hurt more than I expected. Then, why let her announce it? Dad looked down at his hands. Because I thought if everyone was happy about it, you might go along with it. There it was. Not confusion. Pressure. You were counting on me being more embarrassed than you were. He didn't deny it. I knew the title was yours, he said. I told myself ownership and family legacy were different things. They can be. He looked up. But legacy doesn't give you authority over someone else's deed. Mom took longer. When she finally came over, she spent the first 10 minutes explaining traditions, grandchildren, and how much the house meant to everyone. Then I asked one question. If Wyatt didn't have children, would you still have announced that house was his? She stopped talking. That silence answered me. Finally, she said. I thought because you don't have children. Wyatt was the obvious next owner. I felt my chest tighten. Mom, I'm 40. I know. No, you don't, because you skipped the part where I'm still alive. She looked away. That was what had hurt from the beginning. Not that my parents loved their grandchildren. Not that Wyatt had built a family different from mine. It was that somewhere along the way. They had quietly demoted me from owner to caretaker. Mom's eyes filled. We sold you our ownership and kept acting like we still had the right to decide what you did with it. Yes, we didn't. That was the first apology that mattered. Dad apologized too, not for how things came across. For deliberately using a room full of relatives to make saying no harder. Wyatt apologized for believing their vague explanation without ever asking what taking over the finances actually meant. I told him he had nothing to apologize for. My parents still had 2 years left on their family use agreement. I told them I would honor every day of it. Nothing more, nothing less. A month later, Mom called me while making plans for July before hanging up. She said something casually. We'll be at Mallory's lake house that week. I noticed immediately. For once, I didn't have to correct her. A year later. The lake house is still mine. No lawsuit, no forced sale, no family war. My parents still use the weeks guaranteed in our agreement, and Wyatt still brings Serena and the kids up whenever the schedule works. The only difference is that now, he asks, last month, he texted me, would it be okay if we brought the kids up July 12th through the 14th? I checked the calendar. Of course. That weekend, Dad fished with Lena and Bennett off the same dock. Mom made breakfast. The kids swam until sunset. Nothing meaningful had been destroyed. The house was still full of family. The only thing that disappeared was the assumption that loving something gave someone the right to own it. The lake house stayed in the family. My parents just had to learn that a daughter without children was still family enough to own it. If your parents publicly gave away property they had already sold to you, would you correct them at the table or let the paperwork do it later?